So hello, my name is Marnie and I'd like to welcome you to Frankston City Library's FrankTALK with Ruth Clare for the 16 Days of Activism. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which Frankston City Libraries operates, the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. I'd also like to extend that respect to the elders of any other communities who may be joining us today. Now, the United Nations 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence is a global campaign that takes place each year between the 25th of November, so today, and the 10th of December. In Australia, on average, one woman is murdered by a current or former partner each week, and 1 in 2 women have experienced sexual harassment. Violence against women and their children costs Australia $22 billion every year. Now, Ruth Clare is the author of the award-winning memoir, Enemy, and is a passionate advocate for the rights of women and children. Ruth's memoir is about the way she faced her experience growing up with a violent father with courage and strength. She believes honest discussion about the things that hurt us can be the beginning of real change. Ruth, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Now, can you please give us an insight into what compelled you to put pen to paper and share your story in your 2016 memoir, Enemy?
There was a number of things. So, firstly, I read a lot of memoir, and I kept wanting to find stories like mine. I was interested in stories about children who'd grown up in homes with violence. I was interested in whether or not there were stories by children of veterans, and whether or not there was similarities in experience. And I kept reading lots of different memoirs, but I wasn't reading anything that sort of covered either of those topics. And part of me, there was an intellectual curiosity as to, well, I felt like it must be that this isn't a unique thing. And so I started when I was first pregnant with my daughter. It was the first time that I'd ever sort of become curious about my dad's experience in the Vietnam War, because I started to feel all full of all these lovely hormones, and reflecting back on the way my dad treated me, I couldn't imagine how the leap from how you would go from having a child and wanting to, love and nurture somebody, bring a child into the world, and then to the point of how violent dad was with us. So it felt like that needed to be explored. And then I started writing it, and I thought, oh, once I have a baby, I'll have all this time to write. And then it turned out I was completely incorrect, and I had no time. And then when my second child was 2, he went through a phase of hitting me. And that just triggered all of my own childhood issues. And so it felt like I actually have to write this. I have to make sense of what's happening to me and how I'm feeling with him. And all of those childhood memories were just so vivid during that time, because I was getting a lot of flashbacks to my own treatment as a child. So that was what made me finally go, I'm going to commit sitting down, writing 40 hours a week. And yeah, so once I committed, I was pretty into it. It felt,
That's pretty good. That's a full-time job.
Yeah, and because I was so anxious about the idea of anyone actually reading it. So I was so I'd wake up at 4 a.m. and I go, okay, I better start writing now. So I'd write from 4 a.m. till, anytime I woke up, I was like, I'm going to use my anxiety for good. So I'm going to write. So I managed to squeeze in a lot of time due to not sleeping very much.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's quite an effort with kids around you as well. So I absolutely applaud you for that. Now, it was not lost on me that while I was listening to Enemy this past weekend, I actually listened to it on Talking Book through our BorrowBox app, and I loved that you actually narrate it. So for me, when I was hearing voices and emphasis on certain language or tone, that you were reliving it at that time as well. And it wasn't just an actor interpreting what you'd written. I will say I was actually painting my 6-year-old daughter's bedroom pale pink with a giant rainbow as a surprise for her. And the two activities were just so far apart and removed from each other. Now, the lack of support for you as a child experiencing family violence, it really, really alarmed me. You lived in terror and you were constantly on high alert, yet there were no teachers stepping in. There were no neighbours. Even when you went to your neighbour telling her to call the police because your father was trying to kill your mother, there was no sense of urgency. We'd like to hope that times are a little bit different now, thank goodness, with mandatory reporting and things like that. But children are often overlooked in the conversation around domestic violence.
Yeah, I don't know if you've heard of these things. There's at the Royal Children's Hospital, they do these things called grand rounds, which they get experts of all different types coming in and having a conversation around, it might be a new drug or this discovery, but they also, because the hospital's position is that family violence is a health issue because they have a lot of have to deal with the injuries related to family violence. And they asked me to come and speak to the doctors to remind them that you have to be the ones, the adults in the room. Everyone's uncomfortable. No one wants to talk about this. No one knows what to say, and no one wants to do any further harm. And so if you're not comfortable kind of opening up a can of worms, from every medical viewpoint, it's like, unless you're a social worker or a psychologist, who am I to ask the question? And my position on that is, if you're an adult, then you have to pay. As a child, you don't know what you're allowed to talk about or not talk about. And if no adults are talking about it, like even when we were in the police car going from our house to the shelter that night when the police had finally arrived, even then no adult said, how are you, how was that? They start saying, there is this thing where people want you to be resilient, and I totally get it, but you can't just be instantly resilient, like with no processing and not one person saying, how are you, that must have been hard. So that they're asking questions like, oh, what grade are you in, and who's it? And you've just come from this situation where your dad is literally holding your mum down. You watch, I'd never seen that before. It was, obviously traumatic. And no one even said, how are you? Did your dad ever hit you? No one's sort of naming it for you. And it was interesting because I got a few emails after that experience where I had to say to the doctors, you might not know the answer, but you know more than the child does. And if it's something that an adult doesn't tell you you're allowed to talk about, by just even saying, oh, so you're in here, your dad hit your mum, did you have to see that? How was that for you? You don't have to know the right way to respond to that, but if you don't open up the conversation, then you don't even know, and it's also like, okay, so we that the two adults have had an interaction, but unless someone says to the child, does your dad hit you? How are you going to know that information? Because there's all this difficulty where, I don't know if you've read any of Jess Hill's work. She wrote See What You Made Me Do. It's an amazing book. Everyone should read it. But I also read a lot of articles, and there is a pressure that even if a mother reports the father, then it can look, and they separate, it can look litigious, and you go on there and that child services gets involved, it paints a negative picture. So people underreport like physical assault to children for lots of different reasons. But one of the statistics, when I started researching into it, that is not known, that I think needs to be known as much as we sort of understand now, that one woman a week is murdered by a partner or ex-partner. One child a fortnight is killed by a parent in Australia, which is a lot. That's a lot. And we don't ever talk about it. So I think, that needs to be known as well.
And even your mum in the book, your dad would be, as you say, hitting in time to his words. And she wouldn't say anything, like unless it got to a point where it was, you'll kill those kids one day, like stop it, you'll kill them. But it had to escalate to that point.
Yeah.
How does that, reflecting on that, how does that feel, and being a parent yourself now?
It's really interesting because a lot of people ask about my mum's passivity and, terror. She was really...
Well, she was a victim as well, really.
Yeah. And, apart from that one incident, Dad wasn't physically violent with Mum, but he was very controlling, and he was very belittling, and, Mum had very low self-esteem. But and I've said this to I've seen lots of different psychologists over the years, and I knew from when I was old enough to have a thought that I was stronger than my mum. Like, I just knew that. You see photos of me as a child, and there's this one particular one that stands out where I'm standing in front of my mum, sort of like my arm, just like looking at Dad with like, get away from her, because I just don't think everybody's got the same capacity. And that was for me, that was Mum. Mum didn't have the capacity to play that role, to stand up to my dad. She just didn't have that within her.
To give people an idea of what you've been through, I think the hardest thing for me was listening to your earliest memory. So can you run us through that moment of what you remember as a child as your earliest memory?
Yeah, so we were in Brisbane, in our house. We had a sort of 70s house with a big loud wallpaper, and I was playing a game underneath the table, and I saw Dad's legs stop in front of me, and I could tell as soon as he stopped, there was like a snort of breath, which I knew by that stage. I already knew you had to watch out for Dad, and every small gesture would mean something, and so you had to get ready to run. So I knew already that it was going to be trouble. And he called us, and I stayed hidden where I was, but eventually I had to come out. He dragged me out of where I was and stood me and my sister in front of him and started pointing at the wall. And he said, "What is this?" And my heart instantly sank, because it was the label off a box of Tic Tacs that I'd been playing with earlier, and I'd peeled it off and stuck it to the wall. I was forever getting in trouble for drawing on walls and sticking things on walls.
Sounds like my daughter.
Yeah.
I've got to.
And that's like, yeah, no, it doesn't matter how many times you beat me up, Dad.
Yeah.
Always
Yeah.
So he said, "Who did this?" And Kirsten said, "Not me," which was correct. And I thought, oh, this is good. If I say not me, then neither of us will get in trouble. And I said not me. And then he hit both of us. And then he asked again, and again I lied and said it wasn't me. But I couldn't bear my sister getting hit. So eventually I owned up, and Dad grabbed me by the arm, and it was one of those things that as you got used to being sort of abused in that way, it just used to eventually, by the time you're like 10, and this has happened to you a lot of times before, it would just infuriate me because it was so condescending. It would use your body and say, "I'm not hitting you because of the sticker, I'm hitting you because you lied." And it's like, it just felt like it added insult to injury, really. And I managed to get away from him, and I was running through the house, and I tried to hide underneath the couch, and then he pulled me out from underneath the couch, and my hair sort of ripped out because there was springs underneath the couch. And then I wouldn't let go of the chair leg, and he's shaking me upside down, and he just kept, no matter where I ran, he was grabbing me and dragging me. And eventually I was hiding underneath my own bed, and that was when Mum said, "Stop before you kill her." And
Ruth, how old were you?
So I was 3.
Yeah.
And even though that's my first sort of fully formed memory, I know from the way that I responded to it that I was already aware of what the risks were and what was going to happen. So I know that wasn't the first time that had happened.
Yeah. Did you consider it your normal? Like, knowing no different, or did you know that it wasn't right?
I felt like it was really deeply unfair. Like, it felt, on one hand, so there was always sort of two conversations. On one hand, it felt very unfair. But on the other hand, it would be something like, well, I did stick that sticker on the wall and I know that I shouldn't have done it. So there was always some sort of trigger event that made you go, well, he was actually right. He did tell you not to do that. You know, you did run through the house. You did do that thing. You did leave that in, you know, so there was always a grain of truth that there was something that you should have done better. And so I think that makes it really hard to think that if I could have just been a bit more perfect, then maybe I could have avoided, you know, if I could have just been more in control of myself, then I could have avoided the situation. But yeah, it did feel normal, but it didn't feel the same as other people, because I spent a lot of time at other people's houses, getting out of my own house, and, you know, parents are rude. I mean, children are rude to their parents, and you're just like, whoa, how are you getting away with that? You know, like, and you just, it's all much more chill at everybody else's house. So I was aware that we lived in a pretty, you know, stressful household, because I felt so much less stressed when I went elsewhere.
And you talked throughout the book about the sets of rules, and you would come back to yourself and go, right, well, the new set of rules is this, 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 and this, but then this contrasts this or contradicts this, and just sort of knowing there was a new trigger for Dad. But you talk about school being your safe space, and while all this was happening at home, you were actually excelling at school, which kind of bucks the trend, I would imagine.
Yeah, it's interesting, because I have done some research into that, because you expect that if things are going badly at home, then you're going to see that reflected in school. But that's not always the case. You can have extreme overachievers. I just loved school, because it felt like, okay, there's a whole set of rules, and if you do what they ask you, you get an A. Okay. And it felt to me, so that was something that I think was very protective for me, in terms of I couldn't understand how I failed so badly all the time at home, and yet I put in half the effort trying to get things right at school. And I was like school captain, and, you know, everyone, all my teachers, certainly all my teachers, not necessarily all the children, because it's really annoying to have a nerd who's like, oh my God, teacher, me, you know. So my teachers loved me. Until I was in high school, and then I had no respect for my teachers.
Wasn't that normal?
I still did the work that they assigned. I just went, yeah, you're an adult, and you better treat me with respect. And I didn't feel that they did, so I didn't offer them respect in return. Yeah.
And at the end of the day, by the time your mum and dad did separate, and you were at home with your brother and your sister and your mum, and your mum did turn to alcoholism as the coping mechanism. So for a lot of your high school years, you were looking after yourself anyway. You were essentially an adult.
Yeah, it's really interesting. One of the things that I've found so difficult becoming a parent myself is that you're forever tracking what was happening at this age, you know, what was happening now for me in my own childhood. And so my daughter's now 13, and I'm like, oh my God, by the time I was 13, I had basically no parents, because mum was unconscious on the couch. Either, you know, she went through a phase of sobbing and drinking, and just from the moment, you know, her eyes were open, she was drinking and sobbing. And then she eventually transitioned to being more secretive and sneaky with her drinking. And so but you would barely, either way, you didn't have any normal interaction with a parent. And I think that's really, you know, you have to sort of figure it all out for yourself. And so eventually, when I was at the end of year 11, mum said she was going to go and move to Brisbane to get help with her drinking. And I said, well, I'm not going with you. So I did year 12 alone in the house. Like, my sister was there, but, you know, but I'd been forging signatures, and mum had you just never have those. I was in a car accident when I was I must have been 11 or 12. And I didn't even tell mum. And then the parent rang to make sure the parent of the other child said, oh, is Ruth okay? I'm so sorry that happened. And mum's response was, that was really embarrassing to find out about it that way. And I'm like, oh, I'm sorry to have embarrassed you with my car accident. you know, and so like, oh, because you're having to make all of these decisions for yourself, by yourself, with, you know, with that immature 11-year-old lens of going, I'm just trying not to be a burden to you. I don't want you to feel any worse. So yeah, and then, you know, that mum, it would be, oh, I should have known about that. I'm like, well, when would you like me to slot that in between the shopping, or before the first drink, or when you're hiding in your room, or when's the time for talking?
Yeah, before you passed out?
I don't know, before, because I do sometimes shake you and try and wake you up, but it doesn't happen. So
yeah, and I know when she did move to Brisbane, your justification for staying, you were actually saying to the reader, I was going to be better off on my own anyway, because I was doing all these things anyway. I was trying to work out how the bills are going to get paid. I was feeding myself. I was getting myself to and from school. And with her gone, all I could think was, you no longer have to deal with that added layer.
yeah,
And actually, it did make it easier.
Yeah, it really did. Because I think if she was detoxing as well, I would have had to have taken on a lot of responsibility for. I was always sort of a counsellor, and I was just like, I do actually want to go to university, so it adds a whole level of other stuff if you're also having to sort of look after the person who's meant to be looking after you.
Yeah. Now, what is it like to have actually lived with the psychological impact of war that often plagues the families of veterans? Because we do know now that it was the Vietnam War that actually, I guess, changed your dad into the person that you knew.
Yeah, it's interesting because I didn't grow up with thinking my dad's a veteran, because Dad never spoke about the Vietnam War, and we didn't go to any Anzac Day parades, or so I didn't have a concept of the thought that I am the child of a veteran. And it wasn't until I, started researching, what is PTSD and and looking at what those symptoms are, and going, well, that's my dad's exact. And I still think it's not spoken about. I think it's a really difficult thing to talk about because there's so much shame involved in war. And coming back, people have a lot of regrets about, there's traumatic grief, there's all the trauma, there's shame with, Vietnam War had its own shame cloud that it wasn't a popular war. It was, in Melbourne, we've had this experience of feeling out of sync with the rest of Australia. And anytime anyone says anything about lockdown and they're not from Victoria, everyone's like, yeah.
Pretty much.
Yeah. And, you imagine that my dad had this experience of, normal person, birthday drawn out of a barrel, you're going to war. Lots of the veterans I spoke to spoke about this idea. It's like, you're in a war and everyone in Sydney's on the beach eating ice cream. And then, Dad came back from that war, and friends who were good friends would say, oh, where have you been, mate? Been on holiday? And he would just go, yep, been on holiday. And he wouldn't talk about it. And so you're having your whole life's unraveled, and then you're trying to slot, so there's all this research on the way that they rewire your fight or flight response during the training, because you basically, the concept is that when you're going into war, there's no option to run. You've got to learn to override your fight or flight response so well that someone likened it to, as if there's an out of control car careening towards you. You've got to train people, instead of going, oh my God, I want to get out of the way of that car, you've got to train them to walk towards the car, with your own gun. So that's like, a gun is going to kill you. You've got to be trained to walk towards that gun. And it screws with you. And then, so what can happen with a lot of veterans is that the only thing they're meant to do is to explode into action. So you rewire their fight or flight response so that there's no flight, it's only fight. And so what was, this stress response down here, it becomes an anger response. And then if you haven't had any treatment to kind of recenter you, then you can just become explosive. Like, you're just so hyped from that experience, and your nervous system gets completely rewired. So yeah, I think it's, and I still think it's like still cannot find any other books written by children of veterans of any war about their experience. And yet I've been contacted by children of a World War I veteran, children of a World War II veteran, children of a Korean War veteran, like these adult people who are like, oh my God, my experience was so like yours. And yet it's not understood actually that when one person goes to war, the entire family goes to war. And not everyone comes back and is violent, but there are ongoing psychological ramifications of going to war, and the family bears the brunt of that. And so I think it's really important that we understand that when, you know, and when you see, I don't know if you've watched The Crown. Have you? But you know,
I haven't finished it. I'm not up to where they're at, but I'm in the process.
All right. Well, I'm at the Margaret Thatcher era, and
it's all right. I know what happens. It's fine.
There's this one moment where Margaret Thatcher says, we won't get elected without going to war. And that's the Falklands War, right? And this experience happens across the board where people's lives are used for political ends often. Decisions to go to war or enter conflicts or whatever is often, you know, these people who've never had anything like that sort of experience use these people as pawns in that sort of thing. And I just think it's absolutely crap. And I think if anyone has the power to send someone to war, they should be forced to fight in that war. And then they might think twice about whether or not it's really important enough to send people over there, because it doesn't feel like they're thinking of those people as human beings. And it's not just them, it's their wives, their children, their children's children, ongoing.
Especially when it's not dealt with. And I know you've been doing some TEDx talks. You have two. I'm very jealous. But in one of them, you do quote D.W. Winnicott around the false self. And he says, it's a joy to be hidden, but disaster not to be found. How much of that was your truth?
Yeah, I mean, because I am an actor, and, you know, I found acting an absolute doddle because my entire life was one long performance. And because, you know, when you're tend toward overachieving, you know, where you're getting A's and it's like, you know, you can put on a, you know, outfit and, you know, I can sell you that I'm doing really well. I can still do it. And it's still an issue that I have, is that I find it really hard to be vulnerable. So even though, you know, I spend my life trying to be, because I think it's a really necessary space to operate from, especially as a parent, that idea that you know, when people buy your bullshit, basically, you're like, can't you see that this, you know, it just always feels like, can't you actually see what's going on for me?
Yeah, I'm actually crying out behind here.
Can you not see that this is all bullshit?
Yeah.
And no. So yeah, that and I actually did a lot of, and I still have this habit, I did a lot of physical hiding when I was a child. Like I would scan places for places to hide all the time. And, you know, I would always be in like mum's, my favorite was to hide in mum's. Yeah. And I did it right up until I was, you know, in my teens. I would hide in cupboards, and, you know, you have all that right in front of you. You just think, I don't think anyone, if they broke into the house, could see me or find me here. And I still do it when I'm out. I'm like, oh, that's a really good hiding spot. Like I just have, like, it's part of my scanning.
Wired.
Yeah, I'm wired for hiding. So yeah, that was, I physically hid a lot, and I psychologically hid a lot.
How do you fight back instead of surrendering?
What in what way?
Well, I think it's to yourself. So what would it take, or what did it take for you to be able to be kinder to yourself? So to fight back to save yourself instead of continuing to be hidden, and to move forward from your trauma and create a thriving life.
So initially it was just that I couldn't stop crying. The reason that I eventually, I was just like most people, just like, can you make this go away? I would like to not keep crying. Thank you. Yes. Just, you know, and it's like the quicker you could just get those tears out of the way and I'll just move on. I didn't want to go into therapy. I didn't want to do any of that crap. I was like, I just want this not to be, the tears to stop. And that's not what happens. And it's like, you know, that unraveling sort of starts occurring. And I mean, I still struggle with being hard on myself. I'm not, you know, it's not a natural position of mine. And I've had a lot of therapy where, you know, you just have a regular, you know, my therapist that I saw for 7 years every week, she changed my life. I felt like I had a consistent person who I felt like it was safe to be with, that I could be myself, that she would challenge, you know, she challenged the way that I spoke. It's interesting when you actually start talking about how you think about yourself or life or whatever. And she would sort of go, is that it? Or could it be that you're actually, you know, she saw what was behind.
Yeah. She saw your bullshit.
She saw my bullshit.
Yeah.
And she was able to look behind it. And so, you know, but it's bloody hard work. It's pretty excruciating. You have to go to, you know, trauma after trauma. You know, there's a lot to unpack. But ultimately, I think if you're willing to actually take a risk and be more authentic, then all of life gets a lot easier. Like, you know, I used to have a lot of really different friends. It's like, oh, those people can't meet those people because who I am with those people wouldn't want that person. Oh, these, you know, I had this whole.
Oh, we found out.
Yeah, I know. They can't. Oh, they'll hate them. That, you know, it's like, oh my god, you know. So it's like, because you know, you're only being whatever these people expect or want from people with those people. And you know, I had a lot of that sort of division in my life, just twisting myself to be what other people wanted for me. And then eventually, you know, there was some confrontations where it wasn't even confrontations. It was just me actually being honest and saying what I really thought. And some people don't survive that. And that's okay. Because then you get to actually just be yourself with people and you can breathe. Instead of, you know, I spent a lot of therapy for so many years with those conversations you didn't have with people. You know, what I really wish I'd said, you know, so much time. And I still do that sometimes, but less. Often in work where you have to hold your tongue.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a good thing about working from home. No. Yeah. Now, I must say, the book has us finishing at a certain point, but then I loved the fact that you have done some TEDx talks, and you actually tell the story of when you followed your boyfriend of, I think, 6 years it was, to New York City, knowing it's not what you wanted. He was leaving your career behind in favour of his. And you say in that talk about basically that weight that was sitting on you when you did it. But there was a part of me that as you went through that story and finding the courage to say, hang on a minute, that's what I want, that I wanted to be a little cheerleader beside you, just going, yes, do it, Ruth, do it. And it took basically a bulging disc or something that had happened in your back for you to turn and go, you know what, I'm going home.
Yeah. That was, you know, one of those situations where I was like, it was never my dream to go to America at all.
It's actually mine, but anyway.
Probably not now. I would just
times it's okay.
And then, you know, finding myself the whole way across, I had this just terrible anxiety. I felt like I was a total fish out of water in America. Everything I said seemed to cause offense. And, you know, I'm somebody who, you know, I hadn't done a lot of therapy by then. And so that I'm really sensitive to the glances or the, you know, the miscues, miscommunication. I didn't understand how tipping worked. You know, they called anyway, I was,
especially New York.
Well, we were going across, and then it was like we ended up in New York, and I'm like, well, New York, okay, New York, everyone loves New York. And then I just had the exact same experience that it just felt like everything I said was complete. I was wrong, and it was wrong, and I should, you know, everything was just saying to me the entire time it was wrong. But, you know, my boyfriend was doing great. He was getting to live his dream of being a fashion photographer, and I was waitressing, which I did was not my dream at all. Don't ever get me to be a waitress. I am now those waitresses that everyone's like, she ruined my night. Yes, that's
Yeah, I did it for 2 days once.
yeah.
Not my jam. Not my jam.
So yeah, and I felt an obligation that I was the one paying our bills, and if I left, then how was he going to survive there? It felt all of that responsibility to him. And yeah, eventually it was just like I can't. I physically just could not cope being there. And having a herniated disc, so I couldn't even do a lot. I was just lying in bed a lot of the time watching Friends, crying, going, I have no friends. So that was how I got to watch Friends.
Excellent. I must say, what I liked towards the end of the story was, when you started actually telling people what you wanted and what your needs were, and it was something that you were never able to voice as a child, really, like safely. And I think my favorite line of yours was, what will I think of myself if I don't say that?
Yeah.
What was that turnaround like for you?
That was one of the really key parts of my therapy, which, initially the very first time when somebody who, normally if I thought someone was a bit of an idiot, I'd just kind of bite my tongue and not say the thing that I was thinking, so I didn't cause offense and whatever. And then, they'd say something and normally I'd kind of agree. And often what I found was that I would agree or kind of say what I thought they wanted me to say. And then they would get annoyed and I'd be like in my head saying, I didn't even think that. I thought that, it's like, oh, well, this is crap. If I'm failing, even when I'm trying my hardest to be what you want me to be, I may as well, if I'm going to cause offense, I'd prefer to cause offense and say what I think. So I did it as a low risk thing first. So it was with somebody I was convinced that as soon as I said what I thought, they would either just slap me or, run away or hate me and start slandering me to and this was something like, I think that's a bit of a stupid thing to say, or, it wasn't a massive thing I was saying. And so I was working my way up to it. I decided I was going to try this technique. We'd sort of been talking, you do it in the room where you're like, okay, you have someone pretend sitting in a chair. So you're practicing.
Yeah.
And then I had this moment where I said something to this guy. Oh, I had to go to the toilet, prepare myself, center myself, whatever. And I come back out and I'd said something. He didn't even notice. Like, he just acted like that. And I just went, oh, no one actually is paying any attention. Oh, this is brilliant. So, all this stuff in my head that was like, people are going to get enraged at me. I didn't even notice. Most of the time did not notice. And so then I just started it was just starting with low risk people that I thought, okay, if you never speak to me again, I can deal with that. And then eventually it's sort of practicing with them and then getting better and better at just saying what I thought. And then realizing that, nobody knows, there's not a right answer. That was the thing as well. It's like, it's not guess the right answer, because that was what my childhood had trained me. It's like, you have to say the right answer that dad needs to hear. And I did it for mum as well. It's like, I was just her counsellor. I didn't exist. Whatever she needed to hear as support. Oh no, mum, it's completely fine that you forgot to come to that thing. It doesn't matter. I was able to walk home. Don't worry. No, it's complete. Of course, no, that kind of, I don't matter and I don't exist. Whatever you need to hear from me. It was a habit from both of them. So it was difficult to break. I think I've broken it a lot now.
Good. And I must say, I was just, when you were talking then, I was suddenly flashed back to the time in the book where you're talking about practicing your screaming out in the middle of nowhere. Like, that's not a normal thing to do, Ruth. Like, and it was just, I think it came about from your dreams of not being able to scream, which quite often we do. Mine's not being able to put my foot on the brake when you come up behind another car. I think it's the same thing. How do you go from that kind of mindset? I guess that's also going into the fight mindset that your dad had and was instilling in you, to being a healthy parent. So what is it like, or what has it been like, dealing and processing your own trauma while also trying to parent your children?
Hard. I think parenting is hard. I don't know if everyone who has children agrees, but I just find it.
We do. And that's without having an added layer. So.
And so my issue, I still go and see therapists, and I read lots of parenting books because I don't have an internal model for what is okay. And being vulnerable around the thing that you care the most about, like I care the most about being a good parent. That's the thing that all of the rest can just disappear. But I really care about being a good parent, and so it puts a lot of pressure on me to. I put a lot of pressure on me to have I did expect, okay, you've done all the work, you're inner child. I had a pillow that I would sometimes kind of, I was meant to have this ongoing interaction with my pillow. I thought, oh, I have done a lot of work with that pillow, I'm going to be a great parent. But the pillow goes back in the cupboard, obviously, and you bring it out when you're feeling all full and nourished and whatever. And being a parent isn't like that. There isn't like, oh, I'm really tired, I just need to regroup. That was the thing, when you feel like you're falling apart, you've still got to get up. And, that just, I hated that feeling. I still hate that, when you dysregulate around, you've got all these stresses and all that stuff. So I guess I apologize a lot. I do a lot of, if I could go back and do that moment, can I show you what I would do?
Can we role play that?
Yeah, can we do that now? Let's pretend that this is what I did before, because this is how I wish I'd handled that. I do that game a lot, which makes me feel better. And just having to bloody accept how imperfect I am. It's just children. I think if I didn't have children, I would feel like I was a lot. I'm like, oh no, I only surround myself with positive people who are kind of, and it's like, screaming, come down, like, yep. Oh yes, no, I'm quite unhinged still. That's good to see. But then you see most parents are a bit unhinged, so that's okay. It has been, that whole concept of, like, one of the things that growing up in, it's not every situation, but my family was very isolated. We didn't have family friends. There's no drop-ins in my house because it's like I would never invite a friend over to my house. But also we moved away from and I'm sure that's to do with Dad's trauma of trying to be normal with his family, people who knew him before. We moved away, so he was just who he was where we moved to Rockhampton. And so I didn't really have a sense of what a community is, what it feels like to have a community of people that you regularly see and neighbours you interact with. And we were just like, you don't talk about it. This is, so realising, I don't know if you've read Brené Brown or watched her excellent talk on vulnerability.
Everyone needs to watch it.
It's so good. But that concept of being vulnerable and having a sense of community, and that sense of community helps to fight shame. So actually being brave enough, with your mother's group or whatever, to start going, I'm really struggling with this, and then hearing other people are struggling with it, makes you feel less alone, makes you feel less shame, there's less pressure. It's that creating of a community has really made a huge difference for me, just to feel safe enough to tell people what's going on for you, that you're not just, because I have always liked therapy because it's like I feel in control. It's like, I'm paying you cash money, this, I constrain my complaining to this room, I'm seeking professional advice, and no one has to know how I am in the head. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's all right, I can bleep it out later.
So trying to keep it constrained was important, but actually getting to know people and being more authentic with people, and actually finding that you're instantly connected. And I just love that, especially when you've written a memoir, and if someone's read it, that you're instantly in the middle of a really good conversation because they're like, this happened to me, blah, 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 and you go, oh, I love this, so that has been, a real blessing.
I think the two things I loved was when you were talking about your 2-year-old son hitting you. Even at the time, I was like, no, Poppy did that to me as well, like while I was listening to your memoir. And then you were talking about how friends were saying the same things. And you're like, okay, maybe it hasn't been inherited. Maybe, because I can understand that fear. I think most people could, that it was actually an inherited thing. Whereas for your dad, he wasn't born like that. It was it was developed. It was a result of a trauma,
Mm,
as opposed to being born with it. And I think also being able to talk to other Vietnam vets,
mm,
yourself when you were going through that period, and hearing people say, yeah, I really snapped a lot. And yep, I've had to apologize to my kids. And it was really nice, if that's the right word,
yeah.
to know that you were able to find people like that to go, okay, it wasn't just dad.
Mm,
You know, it
yeah.
actually wasn't his fault,
Mm,
but it was still crap.
yeah.
But, you know, at least there was a reason and an understanding for you
Mm.
behind it with the PTSD.
The one concept that was really helpful to me, and it's helpful to me all the time ongoing in my life, is this idea of both and. So yes, it can be both. You had trauma and I had trauma. You behaved this way and you had underlying reasons why that was the case. You hold these complicated thoughts, and I think that's where, for me, compassion grows, is to, it's not saying yes, it's okay for you to have hit
Mm,
children,
not at all.
um, but there, I just think, well, anytime that you try and make a complicated situation too simple, and lack any curiosity about driving, then you've got no opportunity to problem solve either.
Mm,
And I do think that is lacking a bit in the conversation around domestic violence. That there hasn't been enough exploration about how much childhood trauma is being acted out through family violence.
mm,
I do think that is something that is overlooked because people want to simplify. There's a monster there and a poor lady there, but it's actually, it's a really complicated dance. How you end up
absolutely.
in a situation with somebody controlling, and then when that slips into, it might not be violence, it might be financial control, or that whole. I'm currently exploring, just the very beginning stages. I've always got about 50 books I want to write, but the idea of, control and boundaries, as a concept, because I think control is actually something that has been a huge defining part of my life, and anyone who's grown up in a home with family violence, generally, that there's control issues, you know and control and safety, and where that all fits in, and boundary setting. There's another thing Brené Brown said was, that the most compassionate people are the most boundaried people. And I think when your boundaries have been constantly violated, and who you are, and you become fused with your parents, it feels like I'm a pretty porous person. I take on people's problems. Like, to actually know, oh, how do I say no?
Mm,
you know where do you put those boundaries up? I feel like if I can reframe it to be like, oh, this is how you create more compassion, then I think I'll have more energy for that as a concept. So and the people that I know, one of my dearest friends who's very boundaried, really knows, no, I'm not going to do, but she's the most compassionate person, and when she's with you, she's really present, but she will say no all the time, because it's not what's right for her.
mm.
And she's a really good role model in that area, because I think it is important.
It definitely is. And did you find writing your memoir assisted in your healing process?
um in some ways, yes. It was really healing getting to, talk to other veterans, and hear their experiences. That was really healing, because it felt like, my dad died when he was 52. So we never, I was still really bruised and battered, and I was really angry at him when he died, even though I pretended I wasn't,
Mm,
because I didn't want, when my siblings and I stayed up there, while, the last month of his life. And I would have confronted him. If I didn't have siblings with me, I would have tried to have it out with him, because it was so important to me. But I didn't want it to be like the last month of his life was fighting, and neither of my siblings would go with that approach.
mm.
That's not their style. So I didn't want to be the one, um, who was forcing that, to happen. So, um, yeah, that getting to speak to veterans who reminded me of my dad, and having sort of healing, nice conversations, because I was terrified. I was terrified at the idea. I thought I would call up veterans and they'd go, "Who do you think you are telling this? You know, you've had nothing. You don't know anything about anything. You know, we went to war. You were just some little kid. You probably deserve to be whacked." You know, that was in my head, that was the conversation I thought I was going to have. And I just met all of these men who were, the people I spoke to were really broken. And I was that, you know, and one particular guy, Ollie, I spoke to, was really he'd done a lot of therapy himself, and he was really honest about, you know, I would find myself hitting my kids, and I'd sort of come to in the middle of it and think, what the hell are you doing? And his kids were frightened. You know, there's ongoing implications of that for his own relationship with his kids. And just my dad never apologized, or, you know, admitted that he basically, when I confronted him when I was 18, he was like, he didn't know what I was talking about. So it was healing in that way, getting to speak to veterans and hearing how sorry they were. I could imagine that my dad might have felt sorry. So yes, it was healing in that way.
Yeah. Now, what is your advice to anyone watching today who may be experiencing violence, or know someone or suspect someone is experiencing violence?
Yeah, it is such a difficult issue. And I do think there's a lot of shame and stigma around, you know, violence, or, you know, even if you're in a really, you know, if you read Jess Hill's book, she talks all about the fact that coercive control, and they're now thinking that coercive control is going to become something that is a criminal offense. So I think if you are in a situation of family violence, then you need to start, you know, speak to outside help. Start with Lifeline. I recommend everyone start with Lifeline. Before I did any other counselling, you know, when I was around 18, I called Lifeline, and it was the first time I'd had a conversation with somebody, because, you know, counsellors aren't just, you know, here, you know, open up your wounds and let me heal you. You're speaking to somebody who's, you know, hooked up to resources, who understands, okay, well, these are things that we can do. How do we, you know, how can we make you safe in this moment? Have you got somewhere to go? That you can start planning. But it's a dangerous situation, because as most people know, it's when you leave is often the time when that need to control you becomes overwhelming, and that's when a lot of women are killed. Is that at that time. So it is a really difficult situation. And I think we've, you know, if you think somebody might be in that sort of a relationship, then, you know, all you can do is try and have that conversation with them. If that person isn't ready to have that conversation, then it's like you can lead a horse to water. You know, it really has to be the person who's in that situation has to be willing to seek help for themselves, because yeah, it's nigh on impossible to make someone get help if they're not ready.
Now, Ruth, where can people find you online?
www.ruthclare.com. But, you know, I'm at Ruth Clare Author on all the socials. So if you go there, you'll find me everywhere. I'm always rabbiting on somewhere.
And I must say, both of Ruth's TEDx talks are on her website, as is her showreel from her acting days.
Oh, yeah.
So if you thought you recognised her, you might remember her from the McCain ad. I won't say the other one.
Yeah, you'll have to look at my showreel to find out what that is.
So thank you so much for joining us today, Ruth. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I'm sure everyone took a lot from this today.
Thank you.
Now, Enemy is available to borrow via our Borrow Box app, which you can access for free with your Frankston City Library's membership, or of course, at one of our library branches. If you're not a member, you can sign up via our website. You can also purchase Enemy from Robertson's Bookshop in Frankston, and we'll provide a link to this online store when we share this Frank Talk across our social media platforms. Thank you so much for joining us today for our Frank Talk with Ruth Clare for the 16 Days of Activism with Frankston City Council.